On a cold night in early 1945, dozens of German prisoners huddled in their dimly lit barracks, whispering over smuggled scraps of paper and hand-drawn maps. Outside, the camp was quiet. The watchtowers stood against the night sky, their searchlights tracing slow, predictable arcs across the fences. Beneath this calm surface, something was about to happen. In one of the corner bunks lay Friedrich Adler, a 34-year-old former Wehrmacht captain. He listened without joining the whispers. Around him, men he had led in North Africa and France were now murmuring escape routes and timing signals. They spoke of crawling under fences, stealing a truck, vanishing into the American countryside before anyone noticed. For them, this was a chance to return to the fight, or at least to reclaim some sense of control. Friedrich stared at the ceiling, hands folded behind his head. He had been in this camp for months, observing the routines of both the Americans and his fellow prisoners. He was respected, even feared by some. His discipline and quiet authority set him apart. So when word of the escape plan spread through the camp, it was inevitable that someone would approach him. 2 men appeared at his bunk after lights out. Their silhouettes were sharp against the faint moonlight leaking through the barracks window. They spoke quickly and confidently. The plan was set, the tools were ready. The guards at the west fence rotated every 30 minutes. All they needed was his approval. His presence would rally others and ensure success. But Friedrich didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the shadows above. He had no illusions about the war's direction. Reports had trickled in, coded through Red Cross parcels and intercepted whispers. The Reich was collapsing. Escaping now wasn't heroism. It was desperation. And worse, something about the men pushing this plan felt off. Their eagerness, their secrecy, their unfamiliar faces from other camps. Finally, he turned his head toward them and spoke quietly. "No, I won't be part of this." The 2 men froze, clearly unprepared for refusal. One of them leaned closer, whispering harshly in German, accusing him of cowardice, of betrayal. Friedrich didn't flinch. His decision was final. They left in silence, but their stares lingered, cold and sharp. Outside, a dog barked somewhere near the perimeter. The camp returned to its uneasy stillness. In the barracks, plans continued to unfold in hushed voices. But at one bunk, one officer had quietly stepped away. In that single moment of refusal, a different story had begun. One that would expose something far more dangerous than a simple escape. The next morning began like any other. The sun climbed slowly over the flat fields surrounding the camp, casting pale light across the wooden barracks and barbed wire fences. Guards carried out their usual roll call, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, their movements more routine than vigilant. The prisoners shuffled into formation, their breath hanging in the cold air. Among them stood Friedrich Adler, his posture as straight and composed as ever, hands behind his back, eyes forward. To the guards, he was just another number in the morning count. To the other prisoners, he was something more, a figure of authority, a man whose actions carried weight even when he said nothing. Rumours of his refusal to join the escape plan spread quickly overnight. In a camp where whispers travelled faster than official announcements, every barracks seemed to know by dawn. Some reacted with quiet confusion, others with disdain. A few of the younger men who had never served under his command stared at him with open hostility during roll call. Their faces were unshaven, their eyes sharp with a mix of desperation and conviction. Friedrich noticed, but he didn't react. Years of military service had taught him to read men's faces without flinching. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same look he'd seen in fanatical officers during the last chaotic months of the war. Blind loyalty. desperation disguised as bravery, and something darker, the willingness to brand anyone who didn't agree with them as a traitor. After roll call, the prisoners were sent to their usual work details. Friedrich's assignment was light administrative labour inside the camp's supply depot, a role he'd earned months earlier thanks to his fluent English and calm demeanour during inspections. It gave him a unique vantage point. He moved between guard posts, storage sheds, and work parties, quietly observing both the Americans and his fellow Germans. That morning, as he checked inventory logs under the watch of a bored sergeant, he noticed something unusual. 3 men, the same ones who had visited his bunk, passed through the yard carrying crates of maintenance tools. They weren't scheduled for work in that section. Their steps were hurried but deliberate, their eyes constantly scanning for guards. They disappeared behind one of the workshops where the camp fence was closest to the tree line. Friedrich made a mental note. At midday, the prisoners gathered in the mess hall for lunch. Thin soup, bread, and coffee that tasted faintly of burnt grain. The air buzzed with quiet conversation. Normally, Friedrich sat alone or with a small group of older soldiers, men who had fought in North Africa or on the Eastern Front and now spent their days reflecting more than planning. But today, as he sat down, several faces turned toward him, not with camaraderie, but with a silent, simmering question. Why didn't you join us? Across the room, one of the younger men, a tall, narrow-faced prisoner named Kurt, leaned toward his companions and muttered something under his breath. A few heads nodded. One man spat on the floor. Friedrich caught the movement out of the corner of his eye but didn't respond. He had commanded units in combat. This was nothing new. The difference was that here, inside this camp, the enemy wasn't across a battlefield. It was in the next bunk, at the next table, whispering plans he no longer trusted. Later that afternoon, while sorting through storage logs, Friedrich was approached by another German officer, Oberleutnant Hans Bremer, a man he had known since Tunisia. Bremer was older, cautious, and not easily swayed by radical talk. In a low voice away from the ears of guards, he asked the question directly. "Is it true you refused?" Friedrich met his gaze. "Yes." Bremer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "They'll come for you. Maybe not with fists, but with whispers. They don't tolerate doubt." Friedrich understood. In the Wehrmacht, dissent was dangerous. In captivity, surrounded by men clinging to old ideals, it was even more so. But his refusal wasn't driven by fear. It was calculated. He had sensed something wrong in the escape plan. Not just naivete, but deliberate deception. The men who approached him weren't the typical restless soldiers longing for home. Their precision, their secrecy, their insistence on his involvement, it all hinted at something larger than escape. That night, he lay awake again. The barracks were silent except for the occasional creak of wood and distant barking of dogs. He thought about the 2 men who had stood by his bunk, their sharp gazes and clenched jaws. He thought about the crates of tools disappearing behind the workshop. And he thought about the war itself. By early 1945, any officer with a clear mind could see the truth. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded. The front was broken. Escaping into a foreign land served no military purpose anymore. He considered what would happen if the escape plan went forward unchecked. Dozens of prisoners slipping through the fence could easily turn into bloodshed, either through a firefight with American guards or sabotage that might harm civilians. There were rumours of hardcore Nazi loyalists moving through camps, men who saw themselves as the last defenders of a dying regime. He had encountered them before, at the front and during retreat. They were willing to destroy anything, including their own, to preserve their warped ideals. As the barracks settled into sleep, Friedrich made his decision. He would not join them. He would watch. He would learn who was behind the plan and why. And if what he suspected proved true, he would stop it, even if it meant standing alone. The next day, subtle shifts began to unfold. Conversations paused when he entered a room. Men who had once saluted him now avoided eye contact. The 3 men with the tool crates were nowhere to be seen during roll call. They'd been reassigned to maintenance duties near the perimeter, an assignment they clearly had manipulated. He observed, silently, every movement. He understood something few others did. Refusing to escape was not the end of his involvement. It was the beginning of a far more dangerous game. The camp was no longer just a place of waiting. It had become a battlefield of loyalties, ideology, and survival, and Friedrich had just stepped into the center of it. Over the following week, the atmosphere inside the camp began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly sharp. Friedrich had seen divisions among soldiers before, between veterans and recruits, between loyalists and cynics. But this was different. The lines weren't drawn on uniforms anymore, but on beliefs. The closer the escape night approached, the more restless the camp became. Conversations that once centered around food, weather, or rumors of the front were replaced by hushed discussions, nervous glances, and coded phrases exchanged under the noses of the guards. The 3 men who had first approached Friedrich Kurt among them became noticeably more active. They moved through the camp with a quiet, deliberate confidence, as if following orders no one else had received. Friedrich watched them from a distance, always careful to appear uninterested. At the supply depot, he observed them retrieving nails, wire cutters, and sections of timber under the guise of maintenance. In the evenings, they disappeared behind the carpentry shed or walked near the western fence, the one closest to the tree line. No one questioned them. Not the guards, who saw only obedient prisoners performing assigned tasks, nor most of the Germans who assumed they were preparing for the escape. But Friedrich's instincts were alert. He had commanded logistics units before. He knew the signs of preparation not just for escape, but for sabotage. These men weren't just building ladders or cutting fences. They were collecting flammable materials, studying guard routines too closely, and keeping their activities compartmentalized. Even among the prisoners involved in the escape plan, only a select few knew the full picture. That level of secrecy was unusual and dangerous. At night, whispers echoed through the barracks like the rustling of dry leaves. Some spoke excitedly about freedom. Others expressed unease at the growing influence of the fanatics. Friedrich lay on his bunk, eyes closed, listening carefully. He recognized Kurt's voice, fervent and sharp, rallying others with talk of duty and honor. It wasn't the language of desperate men seeking a way home. It was the language of ideologues, men who refused to accept defeat. The camp's internal politics began to shift. Men who hesitated or expressed doubt found themselves isolated. Friedrich noticed that conversations stopped when he approached, or that groups of younger prisoners would fall into hostile silence as he walked by. A few older veterans, including Hans Bremer, remained cordial, but even they grew cautious. Bremer spoke to him one evening in low tones, his back turned to the others. "They're watching you," Bremer said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fence in the distance. "Not just because you refused. They think you're a threat to their plan." Friedrich didn't respond immediately. He had already sensed it. It wasn't open hostility yet, but the tension had shifted from suspicion to scrutiny. The saboteur group, whoever was directing it, had realized he wasn't simply a passive observer, and in their eyes, neutrality was as dangerous as opposition. The Americans, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the undercurrents. Their watch routines were predictable, their inspections cursory. To them, the camp was quiet. They didn't speak German fluently, and what little they overheard sounded like ordinary chatter. The guards were bored farm boys and reservists, far from the front, their attention divided between camp duties and thoughts of home. They didn't notice that a different kind of battle was unfolding inside the wire. Friedrich began to take careful mental notes. Which prisoners met after lights out, which barracks lights flickered after curfew, which work assignments changed without explanation. He mapped out the flow of people through the camp like he once mapped troop movements. Patterns emerged. The same 4 men rotated through the maintenance sheds. One of them lingered near the fuel storage area longer than necessary. Another had begun talking frequently to a kitchen worker who had access to delivery trucks. They weren't just preparing to flee, they were planning something that would draw attention, a diversion. The moment that confirmed Friedrich's suspicions came 3 days later. During a late afternoon inventory check, he passed behind the carpentry shed and noticed fresh sawdust and a partially concealed crate beneath a tarp. When the guards walked away, he lifted the corner just enough to see inside. Short lengths of pipe, nails, cloth rags, and glass bottles. To anyone else, it looked like discarded junk. But Friedrich had seen improvised explosives before, in the ruins of retreating units in France. He knew exactly what it was, the beginnings of a sabotage device. He lowered the tarp carefully, making sure nothing looked disturbed. As he walked away, he felt eyes on him. Turning slightly, he caught Kurt leaning against the side of the shed, arms crossed, watching. Their gazes locked briefly. Neither man spoke, but the message was clear. Kurt knew he had seen something, and Friedrich knew that from this moment forward he was no longer just an observer. He was a variable in their plan. That night the barracks were heavy with silence. Friedrich didn't sleep. The dim lantern light cast long shadows across the wooden floor. He thought through his options with the precision of a soldier drawing up a battle plan. Reporting to the Americans directly would expose him as a collaborator. The saboteurs would retaliate immediately. Confronting Kurt and his men would be suicidal. The only viable path was to gather evidence quietly and find a way to tip off the Americans indirectly without drawing suspicion. Meanwhile, the saboteurs continued to tighten their network. Friedrich noticed coded gestures, a man tapping his tin cup twice at dinner, others adjusting their caps in a particular way when passing through the yard. It wasn't random. They were signalling readiness, coordination, and trust. The camp, once a monotonous place of waiting, had become a chessboard, and he was caught between the pawns and the hidden queens moving in the shadows. By the end of the week, Friedrich understood the full stakes. This wasn't just an escape. The group intended to sabotage the fuel storage depot near the fence as a distraction, hoping to throw the guards into chaos while a select team slipped into the forest. If they succeeded, it could lead to casualties among the Americans and civilians nearby, a pointless act of destruction in the war's dying days. And if Friedrich failed to act, he would watch it unfold in silence. He knew then that his refusal had placed him on a different path. While others prepared for flight, he prepared for a covert war inside the wire. The tension inside the camp had hardened into something almost tangible. It lingered in the air during morning roll call, in the quick coded glances exchanged between prisoners, in the way conversations suddenly died when Friedrich entered a room. The saboteur group was tightening its grip, and Friedrich could feel the pressure closing in around him. It was no longer a question of if they would act, but when. Days turned into a steady rhythm of cautious observation. Each morning, Friedrich moved through his administrative duties in the supply depot, watching for subtle shifts. He noticed that the same group of men had quietly taken control of the maintenance detail near the fuel depot, a critical point along the western fence line. To the Americans, it was just a storage area. To the saboteurs, it was the perfect place to create a diversion. Friedrich had led soldiers through sabotage scenarios before. He knew exactly how such a plan would unfold. A small explosion at the depot would send the guards scrambling, searchlights spinning in every direction, leaving a section of the perimeter thinly manned for a few minutes. That brief window would be enough for a trained team to crawl under or cut through the fence and vanish into the forest beyond. Each night, Friedrich lay awake in his bunk, analysing the situation like a battlefield map. Every choice before him was dangerous. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in whatever destruction they caused. The Americans might retaliate violently, and innocent men could be caught in the chaos. If he acted openly, he risked immediate retribution from the saboteurs, who had already begun watching him like hawks. And if he attempted to tip off the guards too obviously, he could find himself branded a collaborator, a death sentence inside the camp's fragile power structure. The saboteurs' confidence was growing. Kurt, the tall, narrow-faced fanatic, had assumed a leadership role. His voice carried across the barracks in the evenings, quiet but commanding, rallying the younger men with talk of restoring honour and striking back at the enemy even in captivity. Friedrich observed how easily he manipulated them, how desperation turned into fervour under the right words. He had seen this before, on the Eastern Front, in the last hopeless weeks of retreat, when ideology mattered more to some men than survival. One evening, Friedrich sat alone on a bench near the yard, pretending to read through inventory sheets under the pale glow of a lantern. He watched as Kurt and two of his men slipped behind the carpentry shed again. Their movements were rehearsed, efficient. Moments later, a faint metallic sound echoed a hammer-striking pipe, nails being arranged. Friedrich's jaw tightened. The sabotage device was nearly ready. It was then that Hans Bremer approached him quietly. The older officer, cautious but perceptive, had been keeping his own distance from the extremists. He lowered himself onto the bench beside Friedrich, pretending to examine the paperwork in his hands. "You're going to have to choose," Bremer murmured, eyes fixed ahead. "You know what they're planning. You've seen it. If you say nothing, we all pay the price." Friedrich kept his voice low. "And if I act, they'll see it coming. They already suspect me." Bremer nodded slowly. "Then don't act alone." It was a simple statement, but a heavy one. Friedrich understood the implication. There were still men in the camp who respected him, men who weren't eager to die for a lost cause. If he could quietly enlist their cooperation, he might be able to disrupt the sabotage without openly betraying anyone. But that meant walking a razor's edge between loyalty and survival, between keeping his silence and exposing himself as a threat to the group. The next day he began to test the waters. During work assignments, he spoke quietly to two trusted veterans who had served under him in North Africa. They were cautious at first, but when he explained what he had seen, the hidden crate of materials, the increasing activity near the depot, they exchanged grim looks. They didn't share the fanatic's delusions. They wanted to survive the war, not die in a blaze of pointless sabotage. Their role would be simple: watch and relay. If the saboteurs moved earlier than expected, Friedrich needed to know. If guards happened to patrol near the depot at the right time, all the better. It wasn't a formal alliance, just a silent understanding among experienced soldiers. Meanwhile, the saboteurs escalated their preparation. Friedrich noticed new signals during mealtimes: 2 taps of a cup on the table, a subtle hand motion across the chest, a folded napkin left on a bench. These weren't idle gestures, they were timed, coordinated, part of an invisible communication network designed to evade the Americans' notice. The escape wasn't far off now. One night, while returning late from the depot, Friedrich took a calculated risk. As he passed the camp commandant's office, he dropped one of his inventory ledgers accidentally near the doorway. Tucked inside the pages was a small piece of paper, a routine maintenance request for the fuel depot, but with an intentional irregularity: the wrong date and time for a supposed inspection. He knew the Americans would catch the inconsistency. If they followed it up, they'd increase their presence near the depot without him ever saying a word. The next morning, the camp routine shifted just slightly. A pair of guards walked a new patrol near the western fence, passing closer to the depot than usual. Friedrich noticed Kurt watching them, his expression tightening for just a moment before settling into a mask of calm. The saboteurs had noticed too. That night, Friedrich sat on his bunk, staring at the wooden beams overhead. The line he was walking had become razor-thin. If Kurt discovered his involvement, there would be no second chances. The group had grown too disciplined, too paranoid. But for the first time, Friedrich felt the balance tip ever so slightly. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was shaping the battlefield. Still, one wrong move could collapse everything. The saboteurs were close to launching their plan, and Friedrich knew the decisive night was approaching. Every step he took from here on had to be deliberate, calculated, because the next move could determine whether the camp descended into chaos or held together through the war's final days. The decisive night drew closer with each passing day, and with it, the camp's uneasy rhythm shifted into a strange, tense quiet. Even the guards seemed to notice it, though they couldn't place why. Conversations among the prisoners were shorter now, more deliberate. The saboteurs kept to themselves, their movements efficient and precise, like a unit rehearsing a mission. Friedrich moved through it all like a ghost, watching, memorizing, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough. The maintenance area near the fuel depot had become the focal point. Every afternoon, Kurt and his men rotated through under various work assignments. They carried crates, adjusted fences, and stacked planks, always just inside the boundaries of what the Americans expected. It was clever. To the guards, it looked like routine labor. To Friedrich, it looked like a fuse slowly being wound tighter. The turning point came 3 days before the planned escape. Friedrich had arranged to stay late in the supply depot under the pretense of recalculating shipments. The American sergeant on duty barely paid attention. He was more concerned with a card game in the guard room. In the darkness outside, Friedrich slipped quietly toward the carpentry shed. He had learned the saboteurs' schedule well enough to know when they would leave the area temporarily. Under the tarp behind the shed, the crate he had seen weeks earlier was now fully assembled. It contained rags soaked in fuel, small glass bottles with cloth wicks, and short segments of pipe packed with nails. Everything pointed to a timed incendiary blast, not to kill guards directly, but to start a fire that would draw every spotlight and rifle toward the depot, leaving the western fence momentarily exposed. As Friedrich crouched there, studying the crate, he heard soft footsteps crunching the gravel behind him. He froze. Slowly he turned his head. Standing a few meters away was Kurt, his lean figure outlined against the faint light leaking from the barracks windows. His arms were crossed, but his eyes were sharp and unblinking. "Working late, Captain?" Kurt's voice was low, almost casual, but there was nothing casual in his stare. Friedrich rose to his full height. "Checking inventory," he answered evenly. Kurt stepped closer, his boots silent on the dirt. "Strange place to do it." The two men stood in silence for a long moment. Neither moved, neither blinked. In that quiet, the unspoken truth hung between them. Kurt knew Friedrich had discovered their preparations, and Friedrich knew Kurt understood exactly what that meant. But to act now, openly, would risk exposing the entire plot prematurely. Kurt wasn't ready to move yet, and neither was Friedrich. Finally, Kurt gave a thin smile and turned away. "Be careful where you walk at night, Captain," he said softly. "Not everyone trusts you." Friedrich watched him disappear into the darkness, every instinct in his body alert. That encounter had changed the dynamic. He was no longer just a suspicious figure, they were now watching him closely. The saboteurs would accelerate their preparations, fearing interference, and that meant he had to move faster too. The next morning, Friedrich implemented the second part of his plan, planting information without exposing himself. He quietly arranged for an American inventory clerk to find a forged equipment discrepancy report, listing additional materials stored near the western fence items that didn't actually exist, but would draw attention to the very area Kurt intended to use. The Americans, ever bureaucratic, followed procedure. 2 officers inspected the site later that afternoon. From a distance, Friedrich watched as their flashlights swept across the depot. They found nothing, of course, but their increased patrol presence was exactly what he needed. Kurt, watching from across the yard, tightened his jaw in frustration. His group hadn't been compromised yet, but their carefully rehearsed timetable had been disturbed. Inside the barracks that night, whispers turned sharper. Some prisoners were nervous, wondering why the guards were suddenly so focused on the western perimeter. Others began to look at Friedrich with renewed suspicion. He could feel their stares at the back of his neck, hear the abrupt halts in conversations when he entered. He was walking a razor's edge. One misstep, and the saboteurs would strike at him first. 2 nights before the planned escape, he overheard Kurt speaking to his closest men in a dark corner of the barracks. The language was clipped, decisive. They were moving the timeline forward. The diversion would happen sooner than planned, likely the next night, before the Americans could grow too suspicious. Friedrich understood the implications immediately. If they struck early, the Americans wouldn't be fully prepared, and the chance of chaos and bloodshed would increase dramatically. He didn't have the luxury of time anymore. He gathered Hans Bremer and the 2 veterans he trusted. They met quietly behind the latrine after lights out, their breath misting in the cold. Friedrich laid out what he had overheard, the contents of the crate, and the likely timetable. "We can't confront them directly," he said. "If they suspect us, they'll move even faster. We have to let the Americans find the evidence themselves." They agreed on a risky maneuver. At dawn, Friedrich would alter the work logs for the maintenance crews, assigning Kurt's men to a task near the depot under a fabricated inspection order. This would force them to return to their stash of materials at a time when American patrols were most active. If done right, the guards would stumble upon the sabotage preparations by accident. The plan worked better than expected. The following morning, as Kurt's men returned to the depot, 2 American MPs appeared earlier than usual, carrying out a newly scheduled perimeter check. One guard's flashlight swept behind the shed, illuminating the tarp-covered crate. Confused, they called over the camp commandant. Within minutes, the area was swarming with guards. The prisoners gathered along the fences, whispering anxiously as the crate was dragged into the open. Even the Americans could tell what it was: bottles, rags, pipe segments. The sabotage was exposed. Kurt stood among the crowd, his face unreadable. But when his eyes found Friedrich's across the yard, there was no doubt. He knew. That night the camp buzzed with tension. Guards increased patrols, spotlights swept the fences relentlessly, and several prisoners were taken into custody for interrogation. The saboteurs had been stopped before they could act, but Friedrich's quiet war wasn't over. The group wouldn't forgive betrayal, even if they had no proof. And Kurt was not the type to simply disappear into the background. As Friedrich lay awake in his bunk, listening to the distant sound of boots and the low murmur of guards, he understood what he had set in motion. The sabotage had been uncovered without a single direct word from him, but in doing so, he had drawn a one that could not be erased. The camp did not return to normal after the sabotage plot was uncovered. Instead, a kind of heavy stillness settled over it, not the lazy rhythm of routine, but the quiet after a storm, when everyone is listening for the next thunderclap. The Americans tightened security overnight. Searchlights now swept the perimeter in overlapping arcs, guards walked in pairs, and sudden inspections became part of the daily schedule. For the prisoners, this shift was disorienting. Their lives had been governed by predictable patterns. Now every hour held the possibility of disruption. The fuel depot was cordoned off completely. American engineers hauled away the improvised devices and examined every inch of the fence line. They found cut sections of wire, hidden tools, and faint footprints leading toward the woods beyond. For the first time since Friedrich's capture, the Americans seemed genuinely alert. They didn't know who had warned them, and Friedrich had made sure they wouldn't. His forged work orders and planted reports had made the discovery look like a lucky accident. Inside the camp, however, luck was not part of anyone's explanation. Rumours spread fast and sharp. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans had planted the evidence themselves to justify increased control. Others murmured that someone inside had betrayed the escape. Eyes began to turn toward Friedrich. It started subtly, conversations that ended abruptly when he approached, meals eaten in strained silence, glances exchanged behind his back. Kurt didn't confront him directly. He didn't need to. His cold stare across the yard every morning said enough. The saboteur group had been broken up, with several of its members pulled out of the barracks for questioning, but Kurt remained untouched. He was too careful, too insulated. And without hard proof, the Americans didn't know whom to blame. For Friedrich, this was the most dangerous phase. He had succeeded in stopping the sabotage, but now he lived among men who suspected him of being the reason their plan had failed. One wrong step, one careless glance, and he could find himself cornered in a dark corner of the barracks with no witnesses. He adjusted his behaviour accordingly. He spoke less, observed more. He avoided unnecessary confrontations. He spent longer hours in the supply depot, where the presence of guards created a buffer. When he moved through the yard, he walked with the same quiet authority as before, never rushing, never looking over his shoulder. To show fear would be to confirm their suspicions. Hans Bremer and the two veterans kept a quiet watch, their loyalty unspoken but firm. They positioned themselves near Friedrich during roll calls, subtle shields against any sudden act of retaliation. Still, the camp was a powder keg. Even the guards noticed the tension, though they mistook it for simple unease after the failed escape. They had no idea that inside the wire, allegiances had shifted permanently. Weeks passed and winter began to loosen its grip. The war outside was drawing to its inevitable end. Newspapers passed through the camp hinted at Germany's collapse. Cities were falling, armies were surrendering, and Hitler's promised counterstrikes were revealed to be fantasies. For many prisoners, these headlines broke whatever illusions they still held. Escape became less appealing when home itself was disappearing. But for Kurt, surrender was not an option. His small faction continued to meet quietly at night, though their influence had waned. Some men who once whispered eagerly around him now kept their distance, wary of being caught in another doomed scheme. Friedrich observed this shift carefully. Kurt's power was fading, but his hatred was not. The Americans never learned who had exposed the sabotage. They filed their reports, reinforced the fence, and returned to their routines. To them, the incident was an intelligence failure narrowly averted. To Friedrich, it was a quiet victory, not celebrated, not recognized, but decisive. He had prevented what could have been bloodshed on both sides. When the war finally ended and the repatriation lists were drawn up, Friedrich's name appeared like everyone else's. There were no special notes beside it, no commendations. He was processed, assigned a date, and told to prepare for transport. On the morning of departure, he stood in line with the other prisoners as trucks rumbled into the yard. Kurt was somewhere behind him in the formation. Their eyes met briefly. There were no words, no threats, no gestures. Just the cold acknowledgement between two men who had played opposite roles in a silent war. As the trucks rolled toward the gates, Friedrich looked back at the camp one last time. The watchtowers, the fences, the barracks. All of it faded into the distance behind a thin veil of morning mist. He knew his actions would never appear in any official report. No one would tell the story of the officer who refused to escape, who walked a narrow line between loyalty and defiance, who dismantled a sabotage plot without firing a shot. But he didn't need recognition. He had made his choice, and it had shaped the lives of everyone inside those fences, whether they realized it or not. Years later, few would remember that quiet winter in the camp. Even fewer would recall the night a handful of fanatics nearly set the place ablaze. But somewhere in the fading whispers of men who survived, the story of the officer who refused to escape lingered, not as legend, but as a quiet act of defiance against chaos.